Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. July 16, 1969. The Apollo 11 lunar module descends towards the surface of the moon. Through the window, Mission Commander Neil Armstrong can see the rocky surface, jagged and uneven. There is no safe place to land. His landing computer is blaring warnings at him. Data flashes across the board, beeping and alerting him to everything from dangerous landing conditions to the nearly exhausted reserves of fuel remaining on his spacecraft. Neil Armstrong is a veteran. He has flown thousands of missions, many of them in combat, and has piloted hundreds of aircraft. He takes a look out the window, turns back to the board screaming data at him, and turns the landing computer off. He's gonna land this one himself on manual. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here with a special guest today. Today, I am talking to writer, producer, and director Brandon Fibbs. Brandon, thank you so much for coming on Badass today.
Hello, sir, and happy to be here among this illustrious badassery company.
Yes, exactly. We are a very, very elite crew of badasses here recording.
Badass storytellers.
Yes. So, Brandon, you have been working for TV and podcasting for years now. You worked on Cosmos, Expedition Unknown. I listened to all of American football, and I listened to 9 Days in July, which is kind of the one that's a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about today.
Indeed it is. Absolutely. You're right. Yeah. I've been working in science and history, documentary, television, and podcasts now for, 15 plus years. And it is a fun space to work in.
Yeah, I do wish I'd gotten into podcasting a little bit earlier, because I feel like I, missed out on some really good times in the early days of podcasting. I had been doing the website for so long, and I never really I just recently jumped over about a year ago. But I'm enjoying it a lot.
Yeah, for me, it was the pandemic. I had been self-producing my own show, Wiki Surfer, in the years before the pandemic. But the pandemic was kind of one of those things that just opened the world for a lot of us and said, hey, here's this future. Go forth and grab a microphone and go do this thing.
What we are going to talk about today is something that I've written about pretty extensively in the past, and you have done entire podcast shows on. When we asked you to be on the show, you sent a big list of all great ideas of people you'd want to talk about, and most of them were like, yes, absolutely, I want to do all of this stuff. But the one that kind of jumped out, especially because we're coming up on the 55-year anniversary, is the Apollo 11 mission, and that was what you had done for 9 Days in July.
Right. Profiling every day of the Apollo 11 mission across 9 episodes. 9 days, 9 episodes.
Yeah, and that was really well done. I highly recommend if you're listening to this to go check that out, because it's a wild ride.
It's hard to mess up such an amazing story full of so many amazing people. And yeah, if people like what they're about to hear, go check that out, because, I interviewed moonwalkers and people who worked in mission control and people who built the spacecraft. And it was an extraordinary experience and a very honorable thing to be able to do.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so we're going to get into it. We're going to take a really quick break to hear a word from our sponsors. And then when we come back, we are going to get into the story of Apollo 11 and the first moon landing, when human beings from Earth went to the moon and walked around, which is just amazing to think about.
Isn't it?
Yes. All right. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Badass of the Week. I am here with podcaster and director-producer Brandon Fibbs. And Brandon, we are going to talk about the Apollo 11 mission. And
yes.
I guess what we should start with when we talk about Apollo 11 and the significance of the space mission, the moon missions, is kind of what the state of the world was like in 1969 when all of this was starting to go down.
I mean, I think most people, when they think about the Apollo 11 mission and they think about this extraordinary thing that human beings did, traveling to another world, walking on the surface of another planetoid, they come away with just nothing but unbridled optimism. And that was not the world that that was not the state of America in 1969. I mean,
No.
At the time we launched, you had Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy had just recently been assassinated. There were riots going on at the Democratic Convention. Vietnam was in full swing. Like, there could not have been a worse time, just in terms of our sort of national morale, or maybe you could say there could not have been a better time in the state of our national morale to undertake something as great as that was.
That's great. Like, I love that is being brought into context here, because whenever you see things about the space program, here's the movie about the moon mission or whatever, like a lot of times it's like a bunch of guys like having a barbecue in their backyard with their wives and their kids and everybody's happy and smiling, it's like everything's great. But there was a lot of turmoil happening in the US at the time.
That's right.
There was, and we're at the height of the Cold War. There's like this constant threat of nuclear annihilation by the Soviets, right? Like,
I mean, and let's not ignore the sort of elephant in the room, which is the fact that we didn't go to the moon for scientific purposes. We went to the moon, if I can be so crass, because it was a political dick measuring contest, and we were fighting the Russians, and the U.S. didn't want to lose to the Russians, and so we threw everything we had, including a massive amount of our budget for a couple of years, into this thing that was successful and did garner us massive acclaim, and I should say fed scientific inquiry and the evolution of engineering things for decades and decades to come. So it was a momentous thing. But at the end of the day, we have to be honest and say it was that Cold War. It was the threat of all those nukes pointed at us. That was the entire reason we did this. It wasn't for some noble pursuit.
Yeah, we can't let the commies have the moon, right? I can't let the commies put their flag on the moon.
Can't be a red moon. Yeah,
right. Right. And, that's an interesting thing, right? Because so much advancement in technology happens during this Apollo program and during the space program. But that is what you said. That's war, right? It was an active war. And a lot of times a lot of great technology leaps in human history have been brought about by like, how can I more effectively kill other people or prevent them from killing me? And so
that is a tragic bit of human history there.
Yes. We just, like that's where submarines come from. That's where aircraft comes from. That's where a lot of this stuff comes from, is like how, and if it's not designed to destroy something, then the first attempt to like apply it for practical purposes is like, can we use this to kill other people? And if so, how? How can we do that the most efficiently?
Either something is derived for war or somebody will figure out how to use it for war.
Right. And then, but one of the nice things about, going through the history of the space program is that like, at least, I mean, knock on wood or whatever, but like, at least, to date, nobody has shot another person in space, right? So we haven't really weaponized outer space unless you count like military satellites and things like that. But so you do kind of have this, it is one of these badass stories where not a lot of people end up dead at the end of the story, which is a lot of what I cover.
Knock on proverbial wood. The proverbial day is young, but even still. But yes, you are right. That is a one good thing. The Cold War was a war that was fought and won, at least in the space race context, without any violence. There were tragically deaths, but not violence.
Yes, and that's another thing worth talking about as we're kind of getting into the Apollo program and these astronauts, and we'll get into it more when we start talking about the astronauts themselves. But it's very easy to kind of nostalgically think back on 1969 and the space program and Apollo 11 and think of it as, this was great. But we have the advantage of looking back on it now, knowing that it was a success, right? At the time, there was a very real threat of death all the time for these pilots and astronauts who were undertaking these missions. And a lot of people do die during the course of the space program, not only for the United States, but also for the Soviet Union.
Even more so for the Soviet Union,
Yeah. And so, that's another thing that is really worth keeping in mind as we go through the story here, is that like it's a very turbulent time in the United States and in the world. And also like security is not assured at any step of this process, right?
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, like, when you think about Apollo 11, it was just a year and a half earlier that the Apollo 1 fire killed all 3 astronauts on the launch pad, Gus Grissom and others. And that was a tragedy that kind of, I think, drove home to a lot of people. I mean, just how dangerous this was. And they just died because of a fire on the pad. They weren't even in space. We should also say that it is shocking that how successful we were, that we didn't have any astronauts die on any missions. They came close, of course, on Apollo 13, but even that turned into a resounding success. But the fact that more people didn't die in space while we were racing to develop these technologies that no one had even dreamed of just a couple years earlier is mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the Soviets did lose people, but even most of the people they've lost were when on reentry. So yes. Because they didn't have the fleet, like we would do water landings on reentry from outer space, but the Soviets would try to put parachutes up and land in Siberia, right? And sometimes that didn't
quite a few times those parachutes didn't work. Yeah, and they still do it. That's one of the funny thing. Now 55 years later, the Russians still land on land and in the middle of the tundra and stuff, and we still drop things in the water, except for our newest fleet. The SpaceX capsules are being designed, and the new Orion capsule is being designed for ground landing. So that's going to be something new. But I once spoke to one of the astronauts who rode one of the Soyuz back down from the International Space Station. And he said that he might not go back to space ever again, because he said the trauma of that landing, which he compared to the worst car accident you've ever encountered. He's like, that is enough to maybe put me off from going back to space again, because I just don't want to go through that landing ever again.
I mean, just parachuting down from space, it just sounds... And I have no words. Worst car accident sounds like
that's why they call them badasses. That's why you and I are sitting in a little recording studio and they're flying to space.
Yep. I am sitting in a closet surrounded by my wife's dresses. Right. We're talking into a microphone and they are like teeth chattering re-entry, That's how it happens. But them being more badass than me allows me to appreciate their badassitude more. Because if you talk to some of these badasses about their experiences and stuff, a lot of times you get these war heroes that come back and you're like, well, what happened? And they'll be like, I just did what anybody else would have done.
Right.
I don't think so. No, you didn't. Okay, well, speaking of badasses, let's talk about the crew members of Apollo 11 and who these 3 men were that went on this mission. So we have we're at this very critical moment of the space program. There has been a lot of missions have been building up to Apollo 11. The idea was to get on the moon, but we have to get the first guys into space, and then we have to there's the whole entire Gemini program about being able to dock and resupply and take off. And the space program has been going on for years, and the Apollo 11 mission is coming around, and the U.S. government has decided, okay, it's time. This is time for us to try to make this mission to the moon. And we need to pick our 3 best guys to go on that mission. So let's talk a little bit about them. And I think we kind of have to start with Neil Armstrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways it's funny because these 3 guys are almost the same person, right? They're all born in 1930. They all weighed 165 pounds. And other than a single inch, they were all 5 foot 11 inch tall. And they all came from this military background and all this kind of stuff. And it really was, they're almost the same person, but that's like a superficial reading. And then once you start meeting them, they're actually wildly different. And I should say, when you said selecting these guys to go to the moon, it was actually kind of I don't want to say an accident, but it was a roll of the dice as to who was going to go to the moon. We have this image in our minds of like people go, okay, you're Apollo 1, you're Apollo 2, you're Apollo 3, you're Apollo 4. 4, you're the one's going to land on the moon. 5 is this, and that's not how it happened, because people would get sick or people would get injured, or there was like personal issues that someone would have to bow out for, or people were killed, and that would reshuffle everything. And so when Neil and the team got together, they didn't know who was going to be the first person to walk on the moon. It just kind of worked out. That way. But how I should say, before we go any further, like, how do you want to go back into their youth and military experience, or where do you want to start?
Let's do that. Yeah, because these guys are all like, one thing, yes, you're very brave to go out into outer space, and basically these guys are strapping themselves to the top of a nuclear missile and shooting themselves into outer space, right? And they're going to walk on the moon, which we don't know if people can do that. We don't know what's going to happen. It's never been done before. But even before that, these guys have had such crazy experiences as badasses, right? All these guys qualify as badass before they even get into the capsule, right? They're all kind of war heroes, and these test pilot missions that they've been doing. It's really speaks a lot to who these guys are, and the kind of training and mentality that's required to undertake a mission like this, where it's like, we're going to take the nuclear warhead off, we're going to put you on top, and then we're going to count back from 5, blast off, have fun, see you in outer space.
That's right. That's right. And people tend to forget even that the Saturn V, there's, you have that March of Man, I believe is what it's called, that evolutionary lineage where you have like a little watery creature come out of the lake, and then it starts growing into various stages of primate and apes, and then all of a sudden, you kind of end with humans on that kind of scale. People forget that the Saturn V, if you put the Saturn V at that right bit, you go back. The Saturn V's direct lineage, its great-great-grandfather was a V2, a Nazi V2 rocket that, we wouldn't have even, and then everything in between is a Redstone ICBM. Like, everything is missiles, death, raining destruction, until the very end when we're like, hey, let's take that tip off and let's put a human being on there and see if they can do it. So yeah, you are breeding some pretty incredible men to go ahead and in a very real sense, sit on top of a missile getting ready to be lit.
Yes. It takes nerves of steel, and that's what these guys had. So
that's right,
and you'll see it like repeatedly as we go on. So let's talk for a minute about Neil Armstrong. The other thing that comes up with these guys across the board is that not only are these guys experienced pilots. So Neil Armstrong, he was a pilot in the Korean War. He had done like 78 missions.
Nearly 80
in a
missions.
jet fighter. Yeah, he got shot down behind enemy lines one time. He had to make it out past enemy positions. He survived a crash landing aboard an aircraft carrier once. But these guys are also like engineers on top of being badass pilots and physically fit and all of that. These guys are just good at everything. They just have high numbers in every statistical category.
That's right.
Their D&D character sheets would be totally stacked.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and they come from humble backgrounds, right? Like Neil especially. Neil was born in this tiny little Ohio town, had like 5,000 people, and he took a plane ride with his dad when he was 6, and he knew from that moment on what he wanted to do. And after that, he started working at a stockroom at a local pharmacy, and he was saving every penny he could to get a flying license, to get his pilot's license. In fact, he had his pilot's license before he even had his driver's license, before he could even get his driver's license. And then, and he's 17 years old when he begins at Purdue to get his aeronautical engineering degree. But he made the fortuitous / dangerous kind of pact in which he applied for a program, and it basically said, hey, we'll pay for your school if you commit to 3 years flying for the Navy. And what he perhaps hadn't anticipated is that we were about to go into war, the Korean War. And so at 19, he becomes the youngest officer at the Navy's first all-jet fighter squadron. And like you said, he goes to Korea. He has nearly 80 missions, one of which, as you said, he was shot down. And it's insane. I mean, he does all these things, 80 missions. He's this ace pilot. And when the war ends, he goes back home, goes back to college, and he's still just 22 years old. He's already done all that stuff. And then, of course, he goes to Edwards Air Force Base, in which he flew 200 different kind of aircraft. And the thing that is amazing about Neil, and it's one of the things that I think most people know about him, is just how little a personality. And I don't want to say he didn't have a personality. He was just such a quiet, calm, cool, collected personality. He barely talked. He didn't talk that much. But of course, he didn't have to when you're flying, could do all the talking.
Yeah, and there's a great story about when they were training for the Apollo program, and I want to say it was like Michael Collins came in to the office, and they're there in their training, and he comes into the office and he sees Neil Armstrong sitting at a table like doing some paperwork, and he's kind of like busted. He's got like a black eye or something, and then Michael Collins goes in and he asks one of the other guys on duty, one of the officers on duty, like, "Hey, what happened? What happened to Neil's eye?" And the guy's like, "Oh, he just crashed. He was doing like a test mission and he crashed and like barely survived the crash. He had to eject or something. And yeah, now he's sitting there writing the report on it." But he's just like, "Hey, good morning. Hey, good morning."
I mean, that happened so often. When he was a test pilot, he was flying a B-29, which is one of those massive super fortresses, the big bombers. And like one of the propellers exploded and destroyed the two engines next to it. And the pieces of the propeller flew straight through the fuselage and took out another engine on the other side. And he still managed to land a super fortress with just a single engine. And then, of course, if anyone's seen First Man, you know that opening scene where he's flying in the X-15 and he keeps bouncing off the atmosphere because he's flying right at that edge of space and he can't get down. And there were so many things. And I'm sure the black eye that you're talking about was probably an incident. I'm not sure, but probably an incident in which he was flying. It was kind of like a lunar lander.
Yes, that's it.
The flying bed knob or broomsticks or whatever they called it.
This crazy looking device.
Crazy looking device. And it was like notoriously difficult to fly and very, very easy to crash. And he was like 200 feet up when it just dropped. And if he had waited even a split second longer to eject, he would have been killed and no one would know the name Neil Armstrong.
It looks like a go-kart, but if you strap like a jetpack to it, like flies around.
A go-kart with like spidery legs. And,
exactly. And and the fire department had to come out and he should have gone home, right? But instead he just went back into his office and started writing up the report on it, like what he thought went wrong.
And that's so Neil. That's exactly how he was. He didn't get flustered by these things, or if he did, he certainly didn't make a big outward display of it. He looked at the problem, he solved the problem, he wrote the report, even though the problem he just solved was something that's in the history books, for something near cataclysmic.
Right. And so he runs into something like that when he goes on a Gemini mission. He's on Gemini 8.
Gemini 8, yes.
The mission there for Gemini 8 was to we were going to try to dock, they threw basically a piece of junk up into orbit, and then he went up in the Gemini capsule, and his mission was to kind of dock with that thing to see if you could do it. And what they're testing there is, can the Apollo capsule pick up the lunar module? The lunar module goes down to the moon, it takes back off again, but it's got to reconnect to the Apollo capsule to get those astronauts back on. So they were kind of testing that process. And so they had thrown a kind of a piece of junk up there, and he went up there in Gemini and he's flying it and he's supposed to attach it. And he attaches the Gemini capsule to the target module, but then they both just start spinning out of control like crazy. Right. And he has to manually click on the re-entry controls to try to right the spin.
Right. I mean, but before he could even do that, he had to figure out what the problem was in the first place, because he didn't know. He thought the problem was with the target vehicle. So he disengaged, unbuckled, and pulled away, and he's still spinning. And he's not sure what's going on. And it turned out that, one of his thrusters was locked in the on position. And so he had to shut that off and then use his re-entry thrusters to stop himself from spinning. But of course, he needed those re-entry thrusters for re-entry. So, but it's one of those things like, hey, you're going to die anyway, so you might as well.
Yeah, and the re-entry thrusters had never been used in space before. They didn't even know if it would work.
Yep. Yeah, he was amazing. He was extraordinary.
But then we have like audio logs of the mission, and he's just like, yeah, we're spinning. I'm gonna disconnect.
Oh man, that one of the things working on that 9 Days in July podcast, I listened to every single minute of the entire mission, all the days and evenings, everything ever said, and it's amazing. Even if you listen to like the Apollo 13 missions and stuff like that,
yeah,
these guys are not freaking out when this stuff happens. They are like giving this really, very even, monotone sort of, Houston, we have a problem, blah, blah. They're not freaking out because they're that sort of engineer mentality, and that sort of, especially so many of them coming from being test pilots, they are used to putting their lives on the line in really heroic ways every single day. And after a while, the combination of that mindset and the sort of engineering, I'm not gonna help anybody if I freak out. I'm just gonna solve this problem, do the math, and fix it, is exactly the sort of people you want in these kind of missions.
Yeah, completely level-headed. Like, okay, well, here we're having a problem, but like, how are we going to fix this? What are we going to do? And we're going to see some more of that from Neil. But yeah, like every time, like all of the onboard audio for these missions, it literally just sounds like the pilot coming on during a flight and being like, weather at the destination
exactly right.
is 69 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're getting a southwest wind. It just sounds like that the whole time. And they're on this mission, and you would think like if that happened to me, I would be like, get me out of here. We're all going to die.
There might be a little more stress in my voice.
Yes, absolutely. So, but he's kind of like the prototype for what we see from all three of these guys. Buzz Aldrin is also a war hero. He's from New Jersey, but Buzz Aldrin is also a war hero who had also fought in the Korean War, where he received some medals for bravery. He shot down a couple of MiGs
Yes, he did.
while he was, and then, like you said, kind of like with Neil Armstrong, he comes back from the war and gets a PhD in aeronautics from MIT, because of course, right? These guys are just
not
good at everything.
not just a degree, but he's Dr. Buzz Aldrin at the end of that. That's right.
Yes. And so it's one of these things where, movies and TV and video games have conditioned us to, like, we're watching an NFL football game and an offensive lineman, and you're like, okay, well, in a fight, he's bigger and stronger than me, but I'd probably have like a speed advantage. You don't have a speed advantage over that guy. He runs faster than you. He's taller than you. He jumps higher than you. He probably is more flexible than you. He could touch his toes. He's just better than you at everything. And I kind of get that vibe from a lot of these astronauts who are like, this guy's a war hero and a pilot, and he can like withstand like massive G-forces to his body. These guys are like physically elite and like mentally elite, completely calm, collected. These guys are superheroes.
Yeah, and yet Buzz wasn't the calm and collected one, at least when compared to Neil. Like he was he was a loner. He was admired. He was deeply admired, but he wasn't well liked because he was also very blunt, and he was very opinionated, and he was very unapologetic about voicing those kinds of opinions. And he was said that he could outcompute a computer. So he wasn't like, he just didn't have like a lot of that. He rubbed people the wrong way. And when Neil was put in charge of Apollo 11 and asked who he wanted to bring on as his second to go to the moon with, he chose Buzz, despite the fact that everyone's like, why in the world did you want Buzz? And he basically said, yeah, he is arrogant and opinionated, but his arrogance is backed up by his actions, and his opinions are backed up by his facts. And he may be difficult to get along with, but he is the absolute best person for this job because he's not wrong. He knows exactly what he's doing. And that's who you want standing beside you when you land on the moon.
Right. Especially if they're not afraid to tell you, like, I don't think this is going to work. That's information that you'd like to have. You don't want a guy who's just going to go along with everything. You want a guy who knows his stuff and isn't afraid to tell you when he doesn't think this is going to work.
He was also a Gemini veteran on Gemini 12. He was the last Gemini, the last mission. And it was one of those situations where they also had a harrowing thing happen. Their radar failed while they were in orbit. And Buzz literally had to use an old-fashioned sextant, the sort of things that navigators have been using on ships for centuries, and to help them create, chart their course both in space and to get back home, using a sextant and starlight because the computers weren't working. Like that's, if the price you pay for having a guy like that that is a little arrogant, opinionated sort of thing. Yeah, okay, I'll take it.
Yeah. He was up there with Jim Lovell, who was the Tom Hanks's character in Apollo 13,
Right.
commander of the Apollo 13 mission. And yeah, that's it. That's what they had to do. He goes on a spacewalk for like 5.5 hours, which they didn't know if that was even possible. He does that, and then he has to land with like instruments, like old school, like he's sailing across the Atlantic Ocean.
That's right.
Wild, right? And it worked. That's just unbelievable. The kind of technology that they're working with here. When I do, so I co-authored a book called Epic Fails: The Race to Space, about, the space program from the beginnings up until basically the Soyuz missions, where the Apollo Soyuz missions. And when I do these talks at schools about the book, one thing I do is I put up a screenshot of Bejeweled, and I'm like, not only did the Apollo capsule not have enough computer programming to play the game Bejeweled, it did not have enough computer processing to render this screenshot of the game Bejeweled. Like, that's what kind of tech we're talking about here. It's wires and tubes and like...
The average email that you sent at some random point today was perhaps twice as dense than the computing power of the entire spacecraft that they landed on the moon with. The old sort of graph calculators that we used in school had twice as much computing power than anything that we went to the moon with. It is truly astonishing what we did.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. It helps if you have a guy like Buzz Aldrin who can navigate from using the stars while he is in them, right? So
Dr. Rendezvous was his nickname, and with
Dr.
good reason.
Rendezvous, that's an awesome nickname. It might even be better than Buzz.
There's your superhero, Dr. Rendezvous.
Yeah, Dr. Rendezvous, that sounds awesome. Okay, so... and a lot of people, we were talking about this before we started recording, but a lot of people kind of leave out the third guy on this mission.
That's right.
And that is a shame because he's also awesome.
He is awesome. Yeah, Michael Collins is kind of like that proverbial third wheel because he didn't actually go to the moon because his job was to remain in orbit with the command module. People forget he existed, which is a shame because he was awesome. And in many ways, he was the glue that kept those two guys together. He was the lighthearted one. He was the fun one. He was the one that you'd actually, to use a phrase that we really do need to retire here. He's the one you'd want to go have a beer with. And also, but it doesn't mean that he was any less of a badass. In fact, he was prepared to go to Korea. He had signed up. He was a flight officer getting ready to depart for Korea when the war ended, and then that's when he went, like Neil, to Edwards Air Force Base to become a test pilot. And he applied for NASA, and they rejected him. And rather than just go along with that, he's like, "Well, then fine. I'm going to throw myself into my work even more. I'm going to fly even more dangerous planes. I'm going to fly higher. I'm going to fly faster. I'm going to fly longer." And then when he applied again, NASA said yes. And then, like you mentioned, all these guys went through Gemini, which was the program to test if we could dock and meet spacecraft in space and all the things that we were going to have to do before, of course, sliding these guys all onto the Apollo program. So I just love the fact that we have the calm, cool, and collected Neil, the perfect person you want to lead it. You have his blunt, loud, opinionated partner, and then you have Michael Collins, the fun, witty, lighthearted one who held them together. They frequently talked about the fact that they weren't friends in training or even afterward, but they were professionals and they knew exactly what they had to do to pull off one of the most extraordinary jobs in human history.
Okay, I just need to pause here for a minute and let's hear from our sponsors. And we're back. And let's just pick up right where we left off. The advancement here is it's amazing, right? I mean, you had kind of touched on this a minute ago, but one thing that's fascinating to me is that these men were all born in 1930. And when they were born, the Supermarine Spitfire had not been made yet, right? So like they're older than the Spitfire aircraft. And then they go through, they've lived through World War II and the technology is getting better. These jet fighters are starting to arrive. These guys fly jets in Korea. And then after that, they're like experimenting on new stuff, right? Can we break the sound barrier? Can we get up into, how fast can we go? How low can we go? They're building, like, test pilot is such a crazy profession because engineers and technicians, they build these crazy pieces of equipment, and then they're like, we think this will work, but give it a try and see. And if it doesn't, and it didn't often, like sometimes it didn't, like a lot of test pilots were killed, test flying aircraft. And like, for instance, like, the story you just said about the Neil Armstrong and that B-29, and the B-29 was a well-known piece of equipment, but they were trying to do something different with it. And he test flew it and it didn't work and he almost died. But that is an extremely dangerous profession that all of these guys are, they're there and they're volunteering for science and for technology, putting their lives on the line. And just the advancement of technology in their lives is just amazing.
66 years. The flight at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers flying Kitty Hawk in basically a large kite with a tiny little propeller. It wasn't all that tiny, but with a propeller, and then
it was a bicycle engine, though, right? Like
it was a bicycle engine. That's exactly right. 66 years. That's all that separates. And like maybe some of our younger listeners are going to be like, 66 years is a really long time. I promise you, it is not. 66 years is a very tiny span of time to have gone from the first powered human flight in history to walking on another world in one person's lifetime.
It's wild, right? And these guys are kind of in the middle of all of this, watching all of this technology change and move around them. And then it must have been incredible to be part of, but also very dangerous and scary as well. Even talking about like the engineering that went into planning the moon mission, there's a picture I really love of one of the women that worked on the Apollo 11 program. Her name's Margaret Hamilton. And she was like 5'3", 5'4", right? She was a pretty short woman, but there's a picture of her standing next to the flight manuals or the flight data for Apollo 11.
I know the image you're talking about.
Yeah, the stack of paperwork is as tall as she is, maybe even taller.
Yes.
And it's like they're doing all this calculations by hand with like a slide rule and like maybe a calculator, right? Like
that's right.
Just they're hand sewing. There was teams of women who were hand sewing the spacesuits, right?
Yep.
Like
every spacesuit hand sewn, no machines.
Yeah, that's what's going to protect you from the vacuum of space. Is like, I hope they didn't miss a stitch, right? And to put all this together, and then these guys being brave enough to be like, sure, I'll do this, is really, truly heroic.
Especially when you consider, there's that wonderful scene in the wonderful movie The Right Stuff, and it's everyone watching the early test flights of the rockets leading up to the Mercury program. And it's this hilarious bit with this really funny music, and it's just rocket after rocket after rocket that kind of takes off and falls over or explodes on the pad, or like everything's going wrong. It's just explosion after explosion after explosion. And then at some point, you have to put a human being on there, and he has to trust that there's not going to be any more explosions, that we fixed those problems.
Yeah. It'll take off. It'll get like 6 feet off the ground, land, the parachute will eject, and then the thing will explode.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And yet we pulled it off. Like I am still, it's one of those things that just to this day, I'm gobsmacked by what we pulled off. And by we, I mean humans. I don't even mean Americans, because the Russians were also pulling off extraordinary stuff. I mean, we may have beat the Russians to the surface of the moon, but they beat us at just about every other step of that race. They were in the lead for all but the last lap of it.
For satellite, first man in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk. First animal in space, Russians.
Yeah.
I always joke that like with Sputnik, the space race began in 1957 when the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, launched a satellite into space, and we have these ideas of what Sputnik might have looked like, but it's the size of a basketball, and it goes around the Earth, but and it just goes beep beep. It just makes a beeping noise. But if you had a shortwave radio in Ohio, you could point it at the sky at the right time, and you could hear the beep, and everybody was just like, "What?
Yep.
What is this?"
Yep. Scared the crap out of everybody. It would be very interesting to see, I wonder, what would have looked like. You have these alternate history sort of novels and movies that people do. It would be interesting if we never had a space race, if Sputnik had never been launched. We would have got there eventually, but if there had never been a race, it does make me wonder what our world would look like today. Just given the fact that the effort, the money, and the time put toward putting human beings in space and on the moon was the thing that kind of jump-started everything with America's 20th century, latter half of its 20th century engineering marvels, and led to so many different things and inspired so many different things to the point where, we're standing here right now holding iPhones. I wonder how much longer it would have taken had Sputnik not been launched and everyone in America freaked out and said, okay, we gotta get in this race.
Yeah. I have no idea. It's unknowable, but it's a wild thought of how much this contributed to where we are at today. Right now, we're annoyed because it takes 6 seconds for the signal on our phone to bounce off the satellite and get back. Like, internet sucks in your house.
It's moving at light speed, bouncing off satellites in orbit, and what are you complaining about?
I'm trying to load this funny GIF for you, and it's not happening. Stupid internet.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the mission, because we've kind of been building up to it. We've got our crew, and they're gonna they've been training. They've been doing these weird, many different, epic training montage.
Yeah, exactly. Cue epic training montage.
Underwater, they're in the thing that spins you around and makes you sick. They're in the weird jetpack go-kart thing that Neil Armstrong was had that accident with. But at some point they've got to go up on this mission, and that eventually happens in July of 1969. So
July 16th. So they wake up at 4:15 in the morning. They've all been cloistered in quarantine before they suit up. They all report to the suit up room, and they're sealed in their spacesuits, which aren't really spacesuits because they're a much more sort of accurate description is they are spaceships shaped like a human being, because they handle everything, heating and air and everything. They just happen to be flexible enough for you to walk in them. They're basically walking spaceships. And, it's crazy to think about that morning when they get hooked up and the helmets go on, locked in place, portable oxygen begins delivered into their systems. It's going to be 9 days before they ever smell or take in outside air again, or hear any voice that's not on a speaker. Even before they even get on the spacecraft, they're so isolated from everyone else. And then they take the trip up to the launch pad and take the long elevator ride up. And when they get up to the top, they're climbing into something the size of my Subaru Outback. And they're going to be in that or some variant of that for 9 days, which is it's just crazy. And like we've already talked about, that tiny little Subaru Outback is sitting on top of the descendant of a long-range ballistic missile. It's the tallest, it's the heaviest, it's the most powerful rocket ever created at the time. It is 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty, and they are sitting on 6 million pounds of rocket fuel. So if something does go wrong, the only consolation they have is that they will probably never even know something went wrong, because 6 million pounds of rocket fuel is going to be a pretty big boom.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. It's just amazing, right?
Yeah.
9 days. I didn't really, you don't really think about that as much of you're locked in the suit and in the tiny car for 9 days. But these guys are doing it. They're strapped to this thing. They accelerate to 15 times the speed of a bullet.
Yeah. So when it launches off, you're producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And just to once again put that into perspective, that's roughly 3747 jumbo jets, and they are pumping out more than 85 Hoover dams worth of energy. And so you are expelling more energy and force than any other thing that humans had ever created up to that time or would create for decades to come.
Yeah, more than the Hiroshima bomb, right? You're going straight, and it's all directed. You're going straight up in the air.
Straight up. I always like to talk about the fact that the Saturn V, the easiest way to understand it is kind of like a relay race. That in a race, you get the baton, you run around, you come back to your teammate, you hand off the baton, and you stop, and he takes over. It's the same sort of situation here. The first stage expels all of its fuel, drops away. Second stage ignites, gets them that much higher. Of course, once the first stage is gone, you have that much less weight because you've used all that propellant, and so it just gets faster and faster and faster until you reach orbit. And then you can, as they did an orbit, or I think maybe an orbit and a half or something like that, and then kicked in the engines and shot themselves straight toward the moon. It was a 4-day trip to the moon, which they didn't have a whole lot to do, but I'm sure that they It was all incredible building anticipation, and also because of the nature of these sorts of things, probably lots and lots of spreadsheets and things that they had to just take care of along the way.
Yeah. A lot of clipboards, a lot of radioing it back in. Like, here's this thing. We got to do this. And so it wasn't the first time that we had flown to the moon, but the plan this time was going to be to land on it.
Right. We'd been to the moon already. We just hadn't landed on it. We'd orbited it. And then one of the missions, they even came down. They lowered down in a lunar lander to kind of like skim along the surface. They took some really extraordinary pictures. I believe that was Apollo 10 that took some really extraordinary pictures that then allowed them to identify the landing sites for 11. But yeah, and I should say that it was on Apollo 10 as they were doing that. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was that also Jim Lovell? I'm trying to remember who was on Apollo 10. They were very tempted to just ignore everything coming from mission control. And for at least a split second, they were tempted to actually land just so they could be like, yeah, we did it first. It wasn't the plan, but we did it because we're already right here. It's, it'd be like flying low in your plane and being like, I can land. It's right there. I can do it.
I could see that. I could definitely feel that temptation of like wanting to do that.
Yeah.
What are they going to do? Fire us?
Totally.
We're the first people walk on the moon.
That's right.
And so, yeah, after 4 days, they get there and they start their orbit. And then, so the structure of the modules here are that you have the command module, which is where everybody sits. And then you have this lunar module, which drops down to the surface and comes back up again. And there's been a lot of testing involved here, but they've never landed this on the moon before, and we're going to need to try. And so Michael Collins, he stays in the command module, and Buzz and Neil Armstrong get into the lunar module, and they detach to head down to the surface. And one of the things I love about this is there's a picture. Michael Collins took a picture from the command module, and it's of the lunar module descending to the moon, and you can see the Earth in the background. It's one of those Earthrise photos from the moon. And I saw a caption on it once that was like, in this picture, Michael Collins has taken a photo of every human being who has ever lived except for himself. Right?
Correct. Yeah, that picture was actually taken on the return trip. That was before they docked after the moonwalk. Yeah, but you're absolutely correct. Michael Collins took that picture, and yeah, every human being who is or was ever alive is captured in that picture, except for one, the person taking the picture, which is one of the reasons why Michael Collins was dubbed the loneliest man in the universe at several points along this mission.
Wow. And so, okay, so I didn't realize that was on the return, but so on the descent, there is a little bit of trauma.
Just a little bit. Yeah. I mean, they almost aborted multiple times. The first one, just because they had a series of alarms go off that nobody knew what those alarms were, and they started panicking. And Neil didn't want to abort, but a lot of people in mission control were concerned and thinking that he absolutely should. It turns out that the computer was just overwhelmed. It was getting way too much data, and they just needed to proceed. It was going to be okay. But the only reason Mission Control knew that is because of one of the tests that they had run months earlier, in which somebody who was working on the computers feeding them these tasks, because the guys in Mission Control needed to have as much training and go through the same sort of training scenarios as the guys in the machines did, and he happened to recognize that this is not a scary thing. Let's keep going. But they almost pulled the plug. And then no sooner do they get done with that than Neil recognizes that the landing computer is not operating correctly, and that they've already overshot where they needed to be heading down for their landing site. And they've been very rigorous about picking a landing site that was free of any sort of like large boulders and stuff like that, and massive sort of cavities and stuff like that. It had to be a nice flat place, but he's already overshot it because the landing computer wasn't working properly. Those coordinates were way off. And so now then he has to, like, do we abort or do we keep going? He decides to keep going. He absolutely doesn't want to turn around. But at the same point, everywhere he looks is just craters and rocks, and there's no place to set down. And it's not long before Buzz is like, boss, we're almost out of gas. And he has to find a landing site ASAP. And the descent took 13 minutes longer than they planned, and they burned roughly 530 unplanned pounds of fuel. And even though Neil on those audio recordings sounds monotone and sounds like he's not being affected by anything, and even though he probably didn't look like he was being affected by anything, he's, of course, hooked up to lots of monitors, and there's a doctor back at Mission Control who recognized that he was 150 beats per minute. His heart was thundering. And he finally finds this place that he thinks, okay, that's a tiny hole. I can get down there. I can land. They landed on vapors. They had less than 1 minute of fuel remaining by the time they touched down.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, you can't fool the lie detector.
No, you cannot. That's right. The heart monitor lie detector. You cannot fool that. And I got to say, even though it has no bearing to like just this what we were just discussing, but at that very moment when Neil powers off everything and they just kind of sit there, Neil saw something that nobody had really thought about. And it was this awe-inspiring sight. And that is the fact that because there's so little atmospheric resistance on the moon, the lunar dust that was scattered by those engines as it was coming down, that raced away from the spacecraft at the speed of a bullet and traveled halfway around the moon before finally settling. So there is dust from the Sea of Tranquility landing site that is literally on the other side of the moon because it was blasted there by those rockets, and then just because that low gravity just kept flying.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, they asked Neil Armstrong, I mean, he was talking about it once, and he said, the landing approach was by far the most difficult and challenging part of the flight. Walking around on the lunar surface wasn't that interesting, but it's something we looked on as reasonably safe and predictable. Pilots take no special joy in walking. Pilots like flying. Pilots generally take pride in a good landing and not in getting out of the vehicle afterwards.
That's the kind of answer you get when you're talking to an engineer.
Yep. Yeah, they would ask him about it a lot on interviews and stuff after this, and Neil Armstrong would always just kind of be like, it was the culmination of a decade of work from over 400,000 people. And that was it. That's all he wanted to say about it.
And isn't that true, though? Because, we're talking about these three guys, but in actuality, it's not three badasses. It's thousands of badasses working at NASA. It's the badasses that built, like you said, the spacesuits. It's the badasses that built the spaceships. It's the badasses working in mission control and monitoring everything. Like, from start to finish, it's one of the reasons why people who believe that the moon landing is a conspiracy are just bonkers, because there are so many people involved in this that, like, if it was fake, someone would have blabbed, because there are thousands of people who in ways very small and in ways very big contributed to the success of this astonishing feat.
Right. What's the Ben Franklin thing? Like, 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead.
That's right. Exactly. Good old Ben Franklin.
Yep. And so, and so they get there and they land on the moon. I think it was the most viewed television programming ever, like, in history when it happened.
Yes.
I want to say that that's true.
I believe you were right.
And
you better be right, because it better not be a Super Bowl or something stupid.
I'm sure it's been surpassed by an Avengers movie or something, but but yeah, and Neil gets out and he walks on the surface of the moon, and Buzz Aldrin takes the picture that we all know now as the MTV logo. And we have, after all of this time, and like you said, after 60 something years from the Wright brothers, there's a story that the Apollo 11 lander had brought a piece of the Wright flyer on board.
That's exactly right. It did.
When they landed. But yeah, just an amazing culmination of things. And, while this had kind of begun as a Cold War dick measuring, like you said, it did kind of seem to have this global impact, right? Like my wife is from Brazil, and her father was just like, that was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen in my whole life. Like, that was one of the most amazing he's a mechanical engineer too. So he was like the most amazing feats of engineering, most amazing things humans have ever done. It had this very global impact.
The world absolutely united for that, including, it should be said, even in the Soviet Union. There are certain places, I think China and somewhere else, they didn't even broadcast it. So a lot of people didn't even know it was happening. But I believe they watched it in Russia. And even if they hadn't, the government certainly like sent congratulations and stuff. It was one of these sort of reluctant, damn you, you won. And boy, wasn't that amazing sort of things for sure.
Yeah. And so then they walk around on the moon, they get some moon rocks, they collect some samples.
And they don't walk far, by the way. Like a lot of people, I think that they did a lot of walking and stuff like that, but they didn't. Everywhere they went for those I believe it was like 2.5 hours on the moon, everywhere they went for that entire mission, collecting their rocks, setting out different experiments to capture like solar winds and to check moonquakes and all kinds of things, it would have all fit within a baseball field.
Wow.
It was not a big, gigantic area, which is one of the reasons why later missions went with buggies.
Mm-hmm. Try to cover more ground, because it is dangerous to walk around on the moon, right? Like you can't get a hole in your spacesuit, you will die, right? So don't risk it. There's a great the Museum of Flight in Seattle has a great bit that they play. It's a montage of astronauts falling down on the moon, because the gravity looks like to be so fun. You jump and you're bouncing around, but it is hard to do stuff. And so there's like this great supercut of astronauts like tripping and falling and bumping into stuff and falling all over the place because the gravity the suit is cumbersome to begin with, and the gravity is weird. So, but it is dangerous. It's dangerous. Every time one of those guys fall down, there's a chance that something bad's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it got to the point where they were doing it on purpose. I think it was like Apollo, I don't know if it was 15 or whatever. Like they were purposely like jumping and falling and letting themselves bounce, back up and stuff like that, which was freaking everyone out at Mission Control, because lunar regolith, which is the dirt of the moon, basically, for lack of a better term, is this pulverized material. It's an ash. It's fine like an ash, but it's also, if you look at it under an electron microscope, super, super sharp. And even Neil and Buzz, when they returned, they had to clean all of that stuff off as best they could, because even later missions, they started having leaks in their spacesuits just from all that regolith that was getting in there from every time they fell or were purposely falling. And everyone was like, knock that off. You're gonna kill yourself, because this stuff is really, really sharp. Just even the little particulate matter of it was super, super sharp.
That's wild. I didn't realize that.
And also, I want to point out, you mentioned the MTV logo. Some of us are old enough to remember when MTV played music videos. That picture, who is in that picture?
I thought it's Buzz,
Who
right?
is that picture of? I should say. It is Buzz. And the reason it's Buzz is because most people think they've seen pictures of Neil Armstrong on the moon, and they have not. There are no pictures of Neil Armstrong on the moon because Buzz didn't take any. Neil was very good about taking pictures of Buzz. Even the footprint on the moon, that boot print that we always talked about, like one, giant leap sort of image, that's Buzz's footprint. Buzz just got too excited and too into his stuff, and he never turned the camera back on Neil, so Neil doesn't have any pictures of him on the moon surface.
My gosh. Well, there's the video of him coming out, though, right? There was a camera on.
Yes, we have the video of yes. Just the still shots, the actual Hasselblad images. We don't have any of those.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome.
And, we mentioned earlier about all those people who had lost their lives in the moon race. One of the most beautiful things they did after they collected all their moon rocks and did all their experiments and laid out all of their equipment and did everything, and they were getting ready to climb back in, they did something that even people back at NASA headquarters didn't know they were going to do. And that is that they had a little memorial for those who had died at every stage of the space race up till then. And it wasn't just Gus and the rest of the Apollo 1 crew. It was all the Soviet cosmonauts who had died all along the way. Just left a little memorial there honoring those guys, which I thought was just an absolute lovely thing.
With all their names on this little plaque that they left at the moon site before they took off.
Yep.
And then that's it. They took off. Like you said, it was 2 hours. And
but that's not it. Because there's one other super badassery sort of moment, and that is the fact that when Buzz and Neil put on those spacesuits, they are in this tiny, tiny ship. And when they put on their spacesuits to go out for that extracurricular activity there on the moon's surface, one of them, they don't know who, accidentally bumped into a switch and broke the switch handle off. And that switch just happened to be the thing that powered the Ascent rocket that they were going to need to get off the moon the next day.
I haven't heard
And
the story.
they didn't know how to fix it. And while they went to sleep or tried to sleep because it was freezing and it was a miserable night, Mission Control was trying desperately to come up with a way to fix it, and they couldn't come up. They didn't know how they could launch this thing without that switch. It couldn't get reattached. They didn't know what to do. And in the end, Buzz Aldrin, the engineer, just went, you know what I can do? It's the simplest answer. I have this pen. I'm going to put the pen, poke it into that little hole, and I could just use my pen as a switch. Sometimes the easiest things are the most badass results.
The sextant
solutions.
and the pen, right? Like the
sextant and the pen. That's right. That should be his autobiography. The sextant and the pen.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. And yeah, that's why you bring that guy, right? That's why you bring him, even though it's kind of a pain in the ass.
There was no plan B, like if that didn't work, Tranquility Base would be known today as a memorial, like Nixon already had a memorial speech prepared, a very lovely, very bittersweet speech in which they assumed that, those two guys were going to die on the moon, and the president was going to need to give a speech about the fact that now the moon is hallowed by it's now a gravesite for two brave astronauts and stuff like that. But thank goodness that didn't happen because of a felt tip pen.
Yes, there's an AI deep fake or whatever of Nixon giving the speech that you can see on YouTube.
Yes, it is one of the first little AIs that they did a couple years ago. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that is a real thing. He did write that, and just in case those guys didn't make it back. So,
and I should also say that before they did launch off, we talked earlier, and I don't want to ignore him because he always gets ignored, and that's Michael Collins. Michael Collins is sitting in orbit all alone, and when Michael Collins is when he's on the Earth side of the moon, he can listen to Mission Control, he can talk to them, he can chatter, blah, blah, blah. But when he goes around the backside of the moon and he no longer has line of sight to the Earth, he is utterly and absolutely alone. He can't talk to anybody. He can't hear anybody. He is in that tiny little spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, just floating through space. He actually said he enjoyed it. He felt very tranquil in that experience. But man, it's a special kind of badass that says, I'm as lonely a human being as anyone who has ever lived, and I'm kind of finding this slightly comforting.
Right. And I'm looking at a thing that nobody's ever looked at before too, right? Like there's not a lot of people who have seen the dark side of the moon. So like that is another bit that's interesting, right? Like, that's cool. Yep. That is really cool.
Yep.
All right. And so then that's it. Then they get back to the Earth. They have to make it back to Earth. And they have to re-enter.
Yep. Which nothing really went wrong with that. There was a storm. They had to be sent to a different area, and because of a storm coming off the coast of Hawaii. But everything went pretty much like clockwork, and they landed and were put into quarantine and sent back to Florida, or was it Texas? I can't remember which of the two it was, and eventually began their lives. But it's kind of weird sometimes that. Maybe not even sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, being a badass comes with consequences, problematic consequences. And that's the fact that, and you and I were talking about this offline before we began, that badasses rarely live normal lives. If they did live normal lives, they wouldn't be badasses, And there's this terrible strain that comes from doing these heroic things, a strain to yourself and a strain to others. And there was a sign even then as they were in quarantine and stuff and like that. And that is that Buzz Aldrin started drinking heavily. And that set a pattern for the rest of his life. After we don't talk about what happened to these guys after they got back, but, they came back very different men. Just 9 days, they were transformed. And how could they not have been by something, experiencing something that transcendent? But, they come back as these conquering heroes. They're not just American celebrities. They're global celebrities. 150 million people came out to see them. It's estimated that they shook 500,000 hands. Neil Armstrong used to get 100,000 fan letters a day for months and went through and tried to answer as many as he could. It took him years and years. All of the stuff that went into that training and everything, like none of those guys went to space again. They all kind of scrambled to kind of find a normal life again. Neil ended up, after a couple different things, going and becoming a professor at Purdue, where he was a student. He was an engineering professor, a very tough but very well-liked one. But he just wanted quiet. He wanted to kind of fade back into the background again.
Yeah, very Neil Armstrong, right? From what we know about him, Neil Armstrong. There's a story that he went back. He still had a farm. He had a farm that he kept in Ohio. He lost a finger while he was farming. He got it stuck in a tractor.
Doing a farming equipment accident.
Yeah, right. But then he was just like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to do something about that. And then he picked up his finger and took it to the hospital, got it reattached, all good.
Yep, sounds about right.
Yep.
Yeah. And, Mike Collins, he gets out and he starts working for the Smithsonian. He was the first director of the Air and Space Museum. He helped plan and design everything, which if you've never been there is one of the most incredible museums you could ever go to. Yeah. And then later heads up the entire Smithsonian. And he becomes a painter, and he's always talking about the fact that the cosmic perspective of that experience made it so that he rarely got upset about anything anymore, because the experiences he had were so big that he just wasn't rattled by hardly anything anymore. The sad thing is that Buzz wasn't that way. Buzz was a very different story. Like I said, he started drinking heavily as soon as they got back. He drunkenly wrecked a sports car. He started having affairs. His marriage collapsed. Although I should say that of the 30 astronauts who had served in NASA up to that point, 23 of the 30 marriages ended in divorce, including, I should say, even Neil's. There's just something stressful and things about that kind of a job that just kind of wrecked it.
And that was true of the engineering teams as well. The divorce rate amongst the engineering
Mission Control.
Team, Mission Control, all those guys and women,
right.
It was extremely high divorce rates, because it's just like, this is my job. This is what I do. It's the only thing I can do. I can't devote attention to anything else. Right. And Buzz, he kept trying to recapture the thrill of walking on the moon, right? He went to the North Pole. He dove down to find the Titanic. He did a submission down to the Titanic. He was going to the North Pole. He was doing adventure kind of stuff to try to recapture this too. He recorded a rap with Snoop Dogg. I think Buzz did a rap with
yes,
Snoop
Dogg. But that's later though, because he still, it was decades. His grandfather and his mother had committed suicide. His mother, shortly before he left for the moon, she literally said, in a letter, I think, that she was so concerned about the fact that her son might not make it back from the moon that she took her own life before even having to handle that kind of stress, should that have come along. And Buzz's ex-wife and friends were really concerned that was the path he was going on. He ended up getting arrested for disorderly conduct. He ran out of money and was selling cars. He went to a dark, dark place for a long time before going to rehab and psychological counseling and really getting his life back on track. And then, as you said, he really did find a new lease on life, and he was kind of like this new celebrity. It was every time you turned around, he's on The Simpsons or Dancing with the Stars or, like you said, Snoop Dogg or something like that. He was doing a lot of stuff. And of course, he found his central passion again in terms of space. He became, up until the last couple of years, in which I believe it's dementia and Alzheimer's has taken him, and he's 94 now, but is way out of the public eye now just because of the dementia. But even before that, he became just this massive advocate for space again, and particularly for humans taking the next giant leap to Mars. Yeah, I mean, he really did kind of come out of it in rehab, and then he punched that guy in the face that one time. He punched that moon conspiracy guy. And that guy deserved to get punched in the face.
That guy deserved it. Look, it's a free country. You are welcome to say whatever you want. It was lovely.
I've watched that video many times. Punch him, Buzz. Punch him.
It makes me happy.
It is funny. We idolize these guys. We turn them into these international icons. We turn them into these historical heroes. They are, to repeat the phrase of the show, they are badasses. No ifs, ands, or buts. But at the same point, they're just human.
Yeah.
Like all of us, they are just human.
Yeah, it's true. And they have, they're real people. And it's what you said, sometimes a lot of the people I write about are on the show, being good at all of this stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you're a happy person or well-adjusted person. And some of these guys some of these guys come back from these wars. Some of the badasses I write about are war heroes, and they come back and it's different. They're different, and they're not, it's not easy to adjust back into civilian life. I do love that when Buzz was 72 years old, there was some conspiracy theorist who was who didn't think that thought the U.S. faked the moon landing, I guess 7 times, at least minimal. and yeah, called him a liar to his face, and he was like 72 and he punched that guy out, and it was awesome. It's like, it's a free country. You can say whatever you want, but if you're gonna call Buzz Aldrin a coward to his face, well, there's
a 72-year-old man is gonna punch you down.
Yeah, and you're gonna deserve it.
Dear listeners, go to YouTube and watch that.
And that made me happy.
Indeed.
So let's kind of end on what's the takeaway of the moon landing and what made this whole thing so important and so uniting for the Earth?
I mean, I think that the thing you walk away with is, they literally did something that no human being over the span of human history has at any point ever done. And to this day, only 12 people have done. That is an illustrious small company.
Yes.
But in doing so, there was a lot of jingoism, and there would have been a lot more. They planted the stars and stripes on the moon. Nixon wanted to play the Star Spangled Banner and do all kinds of other stuff, and NASA was like, no, we're not going there, because at the end of the day, this is not an American triumph. This is a global triumph. This is a human triumph. And when I have a tattoo, which you can see because we have a video feed here, that I have the Saturn V on my inner arm. Awesome. Every stage, and at the top you can't see it, but I've got all the modules here. And I keep this on my skin to daily remind myself what human beings are capable of doing when they put their mind to something. When they come together and put their mind to something, we can literally travel to the surface of other worlds. And that is a good thing for us to remember. And I am very disappointed that we forgot that for a great many years. And I am thrilled that we are going back to the moon and preparing to go back to the moon right now. There are a lot of different sort of hurdles in our way to get there, but we need to go, because human beings, and one of the things that I love about human beings is that we have constantly, from the very beginning, we are those beings that have a fundamental drive to explore. We got to go see what's on the other side of that ridge. We have to see what's on the mountain. Yeah. We have to see what's over that horizon. We spread civilization on sailing ships. We cross continents. We brave these seas of ice. We dive to these trenches. We conquer the skies with airplanes. That is what humans do, and that is what we will continue to do, because that is one of the things that makes us special. And if there's any sort of encapsulating moment, if there's any sort of spark that shows exactly what humans are capable of doing and where we could as a species go if we get our acts together and stop fighting and just come together as a human species rather than nationalities, then Apollo 11 is that moment. Well, I think that sums it up. I don't think I could say it any better than that. Wow. Yeah. It's just inspirational, right? This is it. This is what humans can do. That's awesome. That's right. Brandon, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really great. I loved it. Thanks for having me. Where can people find more of your stuff? Let's see. By the time you hear this, you'll unfortunately Naked and Afraid XL will have finished, so you'll have to go back and see repeats of the latest season for that. I make daily science and history videos on TikTok at Stay Curious, my friends. So you can find me there. And again, the Wiki Surfer podcast, I should say, we are preparing to make more of those, so hopefully they'll be plugged into people's ears soon. Sounds like a plan. And you can also check out 9 Days in July for a more in-depth coverage of day by day of this mission. If you like this sort of stuff, then yes, go to that. You'll hear from from many of the participants, and yeah, it was that was an honor to do. That's an extraordinary. It's basically this times 9. Awesome. All right. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you, sir. And all of you, thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week with a new badass. Stay badass. Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses.
If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badaasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.